over to you, Farah.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. Really great to be here with you. And it's nice to have kind of a small, intimate group where we can have a really good discussion, hopefully. So I'm going to be speaking about the London Community Response Survey. The way I've structured my presentation is I'll start by giving you a bit of context about the survey, why we created it, how we structured it. We've been doing it for the last 6 months. I can share kind of reflections on the impact it's had and the interest it's generated. Then I thought I'd also just take you through the latest results, fresh off the press. They've just been uploaded onto the London Data Store this morning. But whilst I'm going through the results, I'll kind of talk through the structure of the questions and also just any kind of reflections on what we've heard over the last 6 months on those questions. It's actually, I'm really, really pleased to be here having this conversation with you this week in particular, because we're actually using this week as a moment of reflection on the survey to think about anything that needs to change as we kind of find ourselves in still a bit of a crisis, but slightly different kind of pace of crisis than we were in when we originally designed the survey. So really, really keen to hear your reflections and feedback on what we could do differently. So I have some questions at the end, but as Kate said, I'm really, really happy to take questions as we go along. So if there's anything that's not clear or any reflections, do shout. So the London Community Response Survey started in April of this year, mid-April, and there was a real need across the system. That, I mean, if you can cast your mind back to that time, obviously, there was a lot of anxiety about Londoners whose needs weren't being met. How do we make sure that we catch those kind of risks early to make sure that different partners across the system can address those needs and mitigate kind of things spiraling and getting worse. And there was no really easy mechanism to be able to report on those needs. Obviously, for those of you who've worked with us before, we have a program of work on civil society data, and we've been kind of working on this premise that actually civil society holds some of the best insights on the experiences of Londoners, and if they can be supported on their data maturity journey through programs like DataWise and the work that Superhighways does, actually that unlocks so much insight about the needs of Londoners, because civil society is often the kind of closest to working with those groups. And so we developed this survey with colleagues from the intelligence unit at the GLA for the strategic coordination group. So it wasn't just for the GLA, it was for a set of partners, including funders, local authorities, civil society organizations, infrastructure groups, to try and answer those questions of like, what are the key needs of civil society? What are the key needs of Londoners that we need to be aware of? And it was designed as a kind of pulse survey. So we recruited a cohort of partners, so civil society groups, who we would send the survey to every week, and they would kind of tell us whether demand for certain things was increasing or decreasing, and share any reflections of risks they're seeing. It was a colleague of mine in the intelligence unit, Spencer, who basically copied a version of a survey that's done for the business sector, where they try and predict demand ahead of kind of official Bank of England statistics coming out. So it was quite experimental, but I'm really, really glad we kind of took the flight risk and experimented with this approach. And you'll kind of see the types of insights we've been able to generate. I think the fact that it was developed for a partnership of kind of organizations and stakeholders meant that it was, because often I think surveys are designed for organizational perspective. So I think if it had been designed just for the GLA, it probably wouldn't have been as kind of suited to the sector, as I think it has a wider appeal because it was developed originally for a partnership, if that makes sense. So currently we have 360 organizations that are part of the cohort. Approximately 110 answer every 2 weeks. So initially for the first 3 months, the survey was conducted weekly, and then we moved to an every 2 weeks rhythm. So now we run the survey every 2 weeks. It goes out on a Monday. we send 2 reminders on a Thursday, and then on the closing day on the Wednesday, we do the analysis on the Thursday, Friday, and then on the next Monday, we send out the next survey with the results. So we probably have about 60 organizations that like religiously respond to the survey every time it goes out, and then we probably have another 100 that kind of come and go as their capacity allows, and the kind of structure of the survey allows for that. So we're, you know, it's a 5 to 10 minute survey. It's dependent on if you have capacity to fill it in. It's been really interesting because a lot of the organizations have said that they found it really a useful exercise just as a moment of reflection. So taking, you know, 5-10 minutes to pause and reflect on actually what are they seeing and recording that. I wanted to talk about, I've spoken a little about the audience that we had in mind for the survey. So as I said, it started through conversations with the strategic coordination group who are coordinating the response, the kind of emergency response for London. And it started through a conversation with a subgroup of the SDG, which was the funders, community and voluntary sector group. And so that brought all of these different partners together. The strategic coordination group has been stood down because it's part of kind of the emergency response structures, but the London Transition Board has been set up to kind of support transition out of crisis, because obviously it's not quite kind of a clear end to the crisis, unfortunately. I've made the civil society block bigger than the other one because it was really, really important to us that one of the primary audiences for the data was the sector itself. Is to support them to understand what kind of patterns of need they're going to need to respond to, or they might see at a regional level, but also I think a lot of what we know about data programs is that data use is like people will be motivated by data that they're using themselves. So if you want to convince people to kind of fill out surveys or kind of create better data, the need has to be based on like, well, what are they using? So both in terms of the structure of the questions, but also in terms of how the first people to receive the results are the cohort themselves, because they're the kind of the primary stakeholder for us in this survey. And through that, we think we produce better data that is also useful for a range of other stakeholders, including funders and boroughs and the GLA. But the primary stakeholder has to be the data producer, if that makes sense. These are slightly older stats, but they kind of give you a sense of, so these were some analysis I did a couple of months ago of the cohort. So they need to be updated, but they give you a sense of who's in our cohort. And these questions are only asked once, and then we kind of link the data from this, the kind of the profile information across to each survey. So we've got really good representation from kind of, we have representation from every borough, as well as organizations that are working across the whole of London. Now, one of the questions that I often get asked that I can't answer that satisfactorily is, can you give us a sub-regional breakdown? So could you tell me what's happening in my borough? We have started doing a little bit of analysis at like a sub-regional level, but the reality is that, as obviously all of you guys will know, most organizations don't work neatly in borough boundaries. And so it's actually kind of breaking things down at a borough level or a kind of sub-regional level is, you're making a large number of assumptions about where an organization works and where it doesn't, especially in the current context of kind of digital provision and people kind of borough boundaries meaning even less from a delivery perspective. But we wanted to make sure that we did have inner and outer representation, and that we had organizations representing the kind of the varying experiences of Londoners, if that makes sense. We asked a question about who are the beneficiaries that you work with, and we asked the question twice. So first we asked the question just generally, and as you can see, on average, respondents ticked 10 different groups. So respondents were saying they're working with a whole range of different types of people. But the reason we asked this question is also because we wanted to be able to do some analysis of the data based on the beneficiary group. So like organizations that primarily work with young people, are their patterns of responses slightly different to the cohort overall? Or organizations that work primarily with BAME Londoners, are they seeing slightly different patterns, to try and do some of that more detailed analysis? So we also asked the organizations to pick the kind of top 3 groups that they're working with, so that we can have a sense of kind of categorize the groups, organizations a little bit. So this organization says that they primarily work with BAME Londoners, or they primarily work with disabled Londoners, or with refugees and migrants, etc. Now, these numbers will look healthier if I was to run the analysis again, but in general, we can only do that sub-analysis if the sample is big enough. So at least like 30 organizations that primarily work with BAME Londoners have to have responded to the survey that week for me to do an analysis of that group, if that makes sense. So if, you know, all 9 of the LGBT plus organizations respond, it still doesn't really give me enough of a sample to do a meaningful analysis. So the groups that we have a larger sample of, and we are able to do the analysis for, tend to be organizations that work with young people, organizations that work with BAME Londoners, organizations that work with socially excluded groups, and organizations that work with people with a particular financial need, including poverty. So those are only the ones that so far we've really been able to do a kind of a better breakdown of. As I said at the beginning, we're doing a bit of a review of the survey, and the idea is that we will do a new round of recruitment to kind of increase the kind of the cohort size and hopefully the response size, which will then allow us to do even further breakdowns where possible. Just to give you a sense of the areas of work, again, so this is from a couple of months ago, but we wanted to, in our original recruitment, we were actually particularly targeting groups that were working with a particularly kind of at risk or vulnerable or marginalized groups. So people working with refugees, people working with people for whom English is a second language, people working with LGBT Londoners, BAME Londoners, people who we knew were particularly at risk as a result of COVID. So that a lot of our kind of recruitment focused on that. But it's also open to any organization. So one of the biggest kind of groups is organizations that just work with the general public. But I never tend to pull that out as analysis because it's kind of the same as a cohort overall, if that makes sense. Okay, so now we get to the actual data. Before I start going through this week's results, are there any questions or anything anyone wants to mention from a structure perspective, or should I carry on? I can't see the chat, so if anything comes up in chat, Kate, just let me know.
Yeah, we'll field questions. Yeah, so if anybody just unmutes themselves and asks at this point.
Okay. Sharon, is that a keep going thumbs up? Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so that kind of gives you a sense of the background of the survey, why we set it up, what were some of the things that we were thinking about in terms of the design. I'm going to start talking through the questions, and I'll give a bit more background as I go. So there's only about 5 questions in the survey. Sometimes there's a few more that we add depending on if there's a particular kind of thing that we're trying to understand that week that we ask. We normally add only a qualitative questions. The quantitative questions we don't really mess around with because our intelligence unit has built some code to do the analysis and link across weeks, and any changes to the quantitative questions are very difficult for them to they have to change the code for that. So we have a set number of quantitative questions, and then we have a set number of qualitative questions, and the qualitative questions are a bit easier to kind of introduce because we do manual analysis of that, and I'll talk through how we do that. But the first kind of basic question that we ask is, are you seeing demand go up, stay the same, or go down? And the chart on the right hand side highlights how we've seen that pattern shift. So the demand was really high at the beginning of the surveys. This was in mid-April. And then gradually we were seeing it go down, and week 9 is around about when lockdown started lifting. So you can see that it was kind of reducing as people were starting to get used to lockdown, and systems were in place to get food aid to people, etc. And then as lockdown has lifted, we've seen it kind of slow go up in a slightly wonky way, but it's kind of pretty much been increasing. Very, very few organizations report demand going down. So it's either that from the last time they responded, demand has stayed the same, or it's gone up. So this is a question that's been adapted. Remember I mentioned that we adapted a question from a business survey, and this is that question where we list a set of kind of types of support that beneficiary groups might ask for, and then we ask people, have you seen an increase in people asking for support with, for example, employment? Has that gone up? Has it stayed the same, or has it gone down? And organizations only have to answer the rows that are relevant for them. So in this chart table, that's the one. In this table, you'll see kind of a list of issues that people might need support with, the proportion of groups that are reporting and a higher demand for support on that issue, but also the number of responses. So you just can kind of put that into a bit of context. Again, we try and be really careful with how we talk about this this insight, because as you can see, the numbers that we're getting responses for aren't necessarily huge, and so this is more to kind of give you an indication that you use alongside other data, rather than necessarily say that, oh, this is this has gone up and therefore that's kind of the complete truth. And obviously, as you guys will all know, that with data, just because you're seeing an increase, it doesn't necessarily mean you know why. So for example, if there's an increase in this week, we saw a noticeable increase in people reporting higher demand for domestic violence support. Now, is that because actually lockdown is reduced and people are able to report more easily because they have more privacy? Is that because actual incidents are going up? So the kind of the relationship between a quant number and what the cause is, there's always a gap, and so that's why we have the qualitative questions as well. Some of the ways in which so the rows that I've highlighted in pink, I've just compared from last week's data, or the last data set, which was 2 weeks ago, just to see, are there any percentages that increased more than 10%? And so just to kind of draw attention to those, because something like employment support, people are reporting a higher demand, but people were also reporting a higher demand last week, and that's been a consistently high issue. But is there anything that's kind of shifted from the previous week, if that makes sense? The issues that we were seeing at the top of this table at the beginning, during lockdown, were mental health, social isolation, digital exclusion. As kind of lockdown has started easing, people, that kind of the economic reality of the crisis started to hit, we've seen much more around employment, poverty, housing, debt, as a lot of the key issues that organizations are seeing. The next kind of quant question we asked, and this used to actually be a qualitative question at the beginning of the crisis, but it was a bit difficult to do the analysis, so we changed it to quantitative one. So we ask organizations, what is the biggest challenge you're facing? Pretty much consistently, funding sustainability beyond the crisis and planning for recovery / easing of lockdown have remained the top 2 primary issues that organizations are facing. And that kind of mirrors other research and engagement that we've been carrying out with the sector and the other organizations are reporting as well. As I mentioned, we're reviewing the questions. We're probably not really going to make any changes to the first 2. We might add a type of issue to that second question. This is probably the one that will shift the most, just in terms of that challenge list that we put out. The list is actually longer. There's about 19 different issues that we put in that list, but I don't include all of them because it makes it quite difficult to see any change. Now you'll notice that in this list, and this is where you can see when this question was designed. So it was designed at the heart of the crisis, where one of the big questions that we were asking is, what are the funding needs of the sector? So we actually included 4 different categories for funding. So we had funding sustainability beyond the crisis, funding access to urgent funding for new needs, funding kind of a general funding one, and one was funding, which is on this list, is relationships with funders. And both of all those 4 categories, we designed we chose them with London funders as part of their intelligence gathering for the London Community Response funding program, to try and understand, like, actually where should the weight of funding be? Should it be on emergency funding? Should they be focusing their attention on supporting funders to kind of work more effectively with their funded organizations, or should it be on long-term funding? And so one of the advantages of working with a partnership of organizations to design the questions is you can make sure that you're asking the type of question that organizations can act on. And London funders have been really brilliant in kind of using the survey as a source of insight in how they design their waves of funding. But I don't think we need 4 options for funding anymore in this current context. Also, we had a number of different options for capacity. So I think we had like capacity due to increased demand, capacity due to staff being furloughed or off sick. And again, that was very contextual to that period. So I want to change this question to hopefully draw out a bit more kind of insight on what the challenges are that organizations are facing. So just to make a note of that for you guys, if you do have any ideas, please do share them with me, because that's the kind of thing that I'm exploring this week. Similarly, we ask a question about what the biggest challenge your beneficiaries are facing in the last 2 weeks. So it's kind of similar to the second question that I showed you, but slightly different in that it's asking, like, what's the greatest demand that you're seeing? This has been really interesting. In the first kind of 2 months of the crisis, mental health, social isolation, digital exclusion were consistently the top 3. And as you can see now, actually that's shifted a bit. So mental health and social isolation are still kind of big issues, but actually loss of jobs and lack of employment opportunities and low income have become consistently the top 2 issues that we're seeing. It's also sometimes interesting to combine the second question with this one. So if I just scroll back, you'll see that access to food, 34% of organizations responding, and we have quite a large number of food aid organizations because of part of the way in which we did the recruitment, are reporting an increase in demand for food, but it's still one of the top issues that beneficiaries are facing is access to food and essentials. So that's where you need to be really careful with quantitative data, is that the number doesn't necessarily, the first number doesn't necessarily show that the issue is decreasing as a priority. It's just that it's not, the demand isn't increasing, but it remains a big issue that Londoners are facing. So we try and be really careful with how we talk about the data, and always encourage people to use it alongside other data sets so that they're not making kind of quick assumptions. As I was mentioning earlier, sometimes if the sample size allows, we can do a little bit of further breakdown, and it's mainly on the first question about increasing demand, and on this question about beneficiary challenges. So we can see that actually organizations that work with young people are more likely to mention mental health, social distancing, and family tension when compared to the cohort overall. So that gives you a sense that actually who's kind of facing issues around family tension. It's primarily kind of families or people with or households with young people. Organizations with BAME Londoners were more likely than other organizations to mention loss of jobs as a primary issue, digital exclusion, and no recourse to public funds. The last one, I mean, you probably wouldn't be surprised that organizations with working with low-income Londoners were more likely to mention loss of jobs, access to food, and access to benefits. But we wanted to pull it out to show that that's a pattern that we're seeing. Now, sometimes we add kind of specific qualitative questions in. So, for example, in the last survey, the food team at the GLA really wanted to understand, what are the key risks that food aid organizations are seeing in coming up in the next 6 months. So we can add questions like that in, because those are interesting. Kind of one of the tests we ask is this of interest to the cohort? Will this information be useful to civil society groups? And is there something that stakeholders can act on? So it needs to satisfy both criteria. It can't be something that's just of interest to the GLA. It has to be something that's useful to the cohort as well. But the sorry, if you look at the first few weeks of the survey results, we actually had 3 standard qualitative questions, which we've now combined in the survey into one. So we used to ask a question about, are there any new or growing issues from the last week? We had a question on, are there any groups whose needs are not being met? And then we had just an open, any other things that you want to tell us. You can't tell from the headline on this survey, on this slide. The actual question that's in the survey is, is there anything else you want to tell us, including any new or growing issues or groups whose needs are not being met? One of the challenges around kind of tracking impact of the survey is that in the first 2 months, there was kind of emergency needs being highlighted that you could quickly respond to. So for example, this group does not, so for example, Gypsy Roma traveler communities are not receiving information about social distancing, or they're finding social distancing very hard because they don't have access to water, or things like that. That kind of, there was a quick, like, this has been identified, someone needs to respond to it. One of the challenges now is that some of the issues that groups are raising are kind of big challenging issues, like no recourse to public funds, or lack of housing options or move-on options for homeless Londoners, or rough sleepers. And so it's that kind of like, you've told us something that you're seeing a pattern of. I can't tell you immediately, like, you've told us this and therefore this has changed. And so kind of motivating people to stay involved and carry on telling us what the key issues they're seeing has become slightly harder. And that's one of the other questions I'm going to put to you guys at the end, is like, how can we show that this information is feeding into like our ongoing advocacy on NRPF, our ongoing advocacy on kind of housing options, or the way in which we're thinking about work, or different partners are thinking about work. But also we're not going to have any quick solutions, but this is something that we all recognize as a risk for Londoners. That's been one of the challenges. But so just to share what the kind of patterns we saw in the last 3 weeks, and so just to explain how we do the analysis. So we ask the question and then we do a manual coding. So that means kind of as we read through all the responses, we create a coding matrix and we say, this was the most a response linked to young people was the most common response, and when we're talking about that, this is what we mean. Again, that's easier to do when we ask those specific questions, like on food aid or things like that. Any other issues one is often we get fewer responses when we ask it in this way. But I just wanted to pull out the 3 kind of common themes that we saw coming out of the last survey results. So a lot of groups spoke about the confusion around social distancing, the lack of COVID tests, and I really wanted to pull this out because obviously these results go to the London Transition Board, and for them to understand actually how civil society groups are feeling about all the changes that are coming in and their ability to respond to them. And it's really important for us to put not just kind of just use our words to talk about the issue, but put the voices of the frontline organizations center them in the slide deck, because I think it's that kind of combination of the quantitative data and the voices of frontline organizations really, with data, it's so easy to kind of flatten an issue. But I thought this organization, the bigger in kind of quote on the left, just talking about, kind of really illustrates how confusing it is for organizations that are trying to figure out, should they be opening their centers up or not? And I didn't want to, I've actually had to cut a little bit of it because it didn't quite fit on the page, but it really gives you a sense of the level of confusion that exists. And I think that's important for the transition board, the GLA, boroughs to really kind of grapple with. The other thing we saw a pattern around is kind of increasing complexity for food aid organizations. So them having to make really difficult decisions about who they provide food aid to and who they turn away. And that being obviously a very, very difficult kind of context for them. But also that, you know, systems that were set up during the crisis. So a food aid organization potentially using a venue that wasn't running or wasn't open, now needing to find alternative space. So it's that kind of transition away from like everything being focused on food aid to business as usual returning, but actually what's happening with the food aid. And in previous weeks, we've seen organizations talking about the ways in which they're trying to grapple with not creating a dependency on food aid and kind of reducing volunteer numbers, but increasing demand and etc. And finally, the kind of a couple of people this week, which I really wanted to pull out, raised this issue of the lack of join up between agencies and how that kind of can create real gaps in who and how Londoners are receiving support. So, for example, one organisation was talking about families being housed in accommodation, but the local agencies and civil society groups not being informed that they're there, or the kind of accommodation not being aware of the local support that's available and therefore not referring appropriately. But again, a really kind of important issue to keep in people's minds and how they're moving on. We saw that one of the kind of organizations identified the level of collaboration that took place during the crisis as one of the best things that happened, but we've seen also organizations starting to talk about how that's retracting. So we want to kind of keep that on the agenda as like, it's really important that you continue working collaboratively with the sector. So just in terms of the future of the survey, we are still committed to kind of carrying on with it. I'd probably like to reduce it to a monthly survey at some point, but I think various stakeholders still feel that the data need is kind of every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So there's a bit of conversation about that. But it's this week we're kind of engaging the cohort, which is really exciting because obviously we weren't able to really engage the cohort in the initial design because the cohort didn't exist, but now we can really work in partnership with the cohort to think about the future design of the survey, and that we would relaunch it and do a new recruitment round kind of explaining its purpose in October. It's been, you know, I think we try and we feel that a lot of trust has been kind of given over to us in people taking time out from incredibly busy roles to fill out this survey, and that we really need to do it justice and honor that that time that people have put in to complete the survey. And so you know, we're thinking a lot about where we send the survey, how we make sure it has a proper sponsor, that people are responding to it appropriately, that we're, you know, like Hannah and my team and I read through the results every 2 weeks, and we read through every line that someone has written in to make sure that we're really kind of not missing anything and share and kind of absorbing the kind of reality on the ground, which as you guys all know has been incredibly challenging and difficult context. We've had so much interest in this survey from a range of different partners who are really interested in, you know, how have you done this and how have you recruited your cohort and what was your methodology? So we'd like to produce a methodology document so that if anyone else wants to run a similar survey, they can do, whether that's a local borough that thinks, actually, we'd like to know what's happening in our borough, but be able to compare it to the London picture, and that they can use the same question set, and that way it'll be comparable. Or other cities, but also civil society groups. We saw, obviously, at the beginning of the crisis, a huge number of everyone was doing a survey to try and understand need. And I think the more we can support join up of approaches so that insights become comparable and also the demand in the sector reduces in terms of completing surveys, the better. And a number of the survey respondents have said, you know, it'd be really interesting if you could do a kind of a meta report that says actually what's happened over the last 6 months or the last year, you know, almost like you have the slide decks for every 2 weeks, but actually can you do some more longitudinal analysis? So we're going to explore that. But yeah, I mean, it's been, I think, Spencer, who unfortunately has now left the GLA, but we kind of called it the little survey that could. It was really experimental. It's been, like, honestly, one of the best parts of my job. I really, really enjoyed working on it. But it's kind of also been a real proof of concept, because we've been talking about the importance of civil society data maturity and data insights, as Kate will know, for the last 2.5 years that Hannah and I have been in our roles. And it's really evidence that actually, it's not just businesses and public sector that hold data. Actually, civil society can produce some of the most interesting data about Londoners and Londoners' needs if they can kind of improve their data maturity, or if a clear mechanism can be created to support the sharing of that data, because the data is interesting or useful in the aggregate form. And so that's, I think, one of the things that's been really interesting about working on the survey is it's created a really simple mechanism for organizations to share what's happening with them, but then that feeds into a kind of a bigger pool. And probably the best feedback I get on the survey is from civil society themselves. So as I said before, often groups will say, it's really useful to have a moment to reflect. And I think a lot of people have been keeping a record of their qualitative responses that they've been giving as a form of kind of reflective exercise. But also groups find it really useful to get the aggregate picture and have a sense of what they should be watching out for in the next few months and things like that. So I've probably spoken for, I don't know how long I had, but wow, quite a long time. But I'll pause here. I do have a set of questions, but I might just stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other a bit better and just kind of move into the discussion.